I'm Sarah Kane, and I'm the lead researcher for the Health Wyze report, formerly of Naturally Good magazine. We're creating a documentary called Prescription for Manslaughter. The movie is about antidepressants, and how they can cause some people to lose their sense of reality, and in that dream state, commit terrible acts. Every school shooting in America has involved psychiatric drugs, but that's been censored by the big media houses.
The FDA does not regulate the drug industry. Instead, the FDA is a business partner of the drug industry, which gives it 32 times what it makes from tax revenue. Again, that's 32 times. Unfortunately, we're not funded by Big Pharma. In fact, we don't have outside funding from anywhere, except for an occasional donation. We began creating this documentary without funding, because it has to be made, and it's probably the most difficult health topic that we could have chosen. People are taking commonly prescribed psychiatric drugs without knowing that there's a legitimate risk that they could go out and kill somebody close to them while having no control over their own actions. These people often wake up in a prison cell or a juvenile detention center and are later told of their crimes by observers. By producing this documentary, we're going up against the most ruthless and powerful group in the industrialized world, so we need your help. People's lives literally depend upon us getting community support. There are other films out there that are likewise worth sponsoring, but Prescription for Manslaughter will directly save people's lives, and prevent some from being unjustly sent to prison for the rest of their lives. The documentary will be having a special Creative Commons style copyright that will allow for non-commercial redistribution via the internet, without restrictions. We can be contacted at healthwyze.org with Wyze spelt W-Y-Z-E. Next are some clips from the documentary so that you can see the direction that we're going in, get a feel for it, and understand just how important this project is.
Because of the media's ties with Big Pharma, you have likely never learned this neurologically degenerative, drug-induced, psychopathological and physical condition which has become common. In the official pharmaceutical literature of today, akathisia is most often referenced as an emotional blunting. And what this means in plain language, minus the mitigating marketing, is that the victim of this condition experiences a suppression of all emotions, subsequently causing something of a zombie state. The significance of this is that a person's conscience and his ability to recognize consequences are derived from his ability to emotionally empathize with the suffering of others and to experience fear. A patient, or anyone else for that matter, becomes a dangerous person whenever the emotions behind his conscience are chemically neutralized for the sake of suppressing inconvenient emotions, such as depression. Akathisia is the clear connection between psychiatric drugs, sociopathology, and psychopathology. For a small percentage of the population, akathisia produces a dreamy state, or more aptly, it's a nightmare state whilst being partially awake. In these special cases, it becomes a type of psychiatric drug-induced sleepwalking, whereby the person unconsciously acts in a sociopathic or a psychopathic manner. It is a state in which friends and families may suddenly become monsters, who must be exterminated. For these tragic cases, akathisia is like being possessed by a demon, except that the patient is actually possessed by a chemical. Akathisia is known to occur with every SSRI antidepressant and certain other psychiatric medications, particularly the antipsychotics. The irony of antidepressants causing suicides and antipsychotics causing psychosis is hard to miss. The FDA still refuses to label any drugs with a homicidality risk, although it was eventually willing to issue a black box suicidality warning for SSRI antidepressants, but only after immense public pressure from people who had lost loved ones.
But why? This isn't worth it. This is a problem. Please don't. Please don't. Please. I'm going.
The trail can often lead right to the medicine chest.
To
2 years ago, 16-year-old Corey Badsgard took a rifle to his high school and held 23 classmates hostage.
I felt sick, didn't feel like really, like I could get up very well. And so I went back to bed, and next thing I remember, I'm in juvie in the detention center where I used to live.
Just one more apparently unexplainable violent outburst at school. At Fox News, we found the Badsgard story with antidepressants compelling, so we investigated further. We found a disturbing number of recent school shooters were either on medication or were experiencing withdrawal. The list includes 15-year-old Kip Kinkle withdrawing from Prozac when he shot 22 classmates, killing 2 after murdering his mother and stepfather at his home in Springfield, Oregon. 14-year-old Elizabeth Bush on Prozac when she blasted away at fellow students in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, wounding 1. 18-year-old Jason Hoffman on Effexor and Celexa when he opened fire at his California high school, wounding 5. 15-year-old Sean Cooper on a mix of antidepressants when he shot students in Idaho. 15-year-old TJ Solomon also on a mix of antidepressants when he aimed his shotgun at classmates in Conyers, Georgia, wounding 6. And 17-year-old Eric Harris on Luvox when he and partner Dylan Klebold killed 12 classmates and a teacher in the bloodiest school massacre yet, Columbine.
A 14-year-old sits in the Madison County Metro Jail charged with the murder of his classmate.
A 20-page mental evaluation sits on the desk of attorney Bruce Gardner for his client, 14-year-old Hamad Memin, who is in a padded cell in solitary confinement under suicide watch at the Madison County Jail. He's been there since Friday when a judge decided he will stand trial as an adult in the shooting death of classmate Todd Brown. Gardner says he sat down with his client, who's not holding up well.
Emotionally blunted, sort of robot look about this young man that's kind of frightening.
You're the devil in disguise. Oh, yes, you are. Devil in disguise.
The first school massacre in the United States happened on August 1st, 1966, at the University of Texas, in the city of Austin. The killer was Charles Whitman, a former U.S. Marine sniper and Eagle Scout. To get an ideal location to randomly sniper his victims, he climbed to the top of the clock tower at the university, where he rained bullets on pedestrians. He had murdered his wife and mother the night before. Prior to the 2007 massacre at Virginia Polytechnic Institute, the University of Texas at Austin massacre by Whitman was the worst school shooting in American history, in both deaths and injuries. Charles Whitman had seen multiple psychiatrists at the same university and had been given prescriptions for both Valium and Dexedrine by university doctors in order to cope with his violent impulses. Dexedrine was used as an antidepressant in the late 1960s, and it is known for causing akathisia. Thus, it increases the risk of violent behaviors, whereas untreated depressives tend to be significantly less violent. The large media houses cooperated in the cover-up by merely reporting his psychiatric visits to convince the public that it was Whitman's organic mental problems that were to blame, instead of the censored psychiatric medications. This is a journalistic pattern that has been repeated thousands of times in reports of violent crimes. Such repeated dishonest omissions by our media corporations are also terribly convenient in promoting their agenda to disarm the American public, regardless of whether the reporters are doing it to actively promote the New World Order, of which the U.S. Bill of Rights is still a huge hurdle, or because they merely have a strong leftist bent. People were still dead, and the staff at the university in Austin wanted to quickly wash their hands of all responsibility in the matter. They had to watch out for their tenured assets, after all. The media was more than willing to help the university and the pharmaceutical industry to suppress the Dexedrine connection. One doctor, Dr. Heatley, was honorable enough to come forward with his records on Whitman, despite the university's posturing. Dr. Heatley observed that Whitman had quickly become overwhelmed by hostility with a minimum of provocation, had violent impulses, and Whitman had made vivid references to, quote, thinking about going up on the tower with a deer rifle and start shooting people, unquote. He wrote of his plan to kill his wife as painlessly as possible so that she would not suffer with grief when he died, and noted his constant aggressive impulses. His lack of understanding of his own thoughts, rapid changes in mood, impulsivity, and vivid thoughts of violent acts were all characteristic of psychiatric drug intoxication. But in all likelihood, The doctors increased his dosage in response to the bad reaction, which is actually a standard procedure in psychiatry for bad drug reactions. The most infamous of all school shootings was the one that happened at Columbine High School. Columbine is a word that still sends chills through the spines of most Americans, even at more than a decade later. After the massacre, the media thoroughly distracted and misdirected the public away from the pharmaceutical connections. People who remember the years following the massacre at Columbine High School will remember the blame being shifted onto school administrators, gun ownership, rock music, and even video games. Investigating it is now fraught with challenges, and technically, such investigative journalism in the Columbine case is potentially illegal, due to the fact that U.S. District Judge Louis T. Babcock ordered that all related records from Columbine litigation attempts be sealed for no less than 20 years. In all our research, we had never before seen a court seal all of the records for anything, nor censor records for 20 years after a case's closure. Such an order is in itself illegal and therefore virtually unheard of. Most amazing is that the records were permanently sealed for a dismissed case that never saw a trial. Thus, there were no actual proceedings to be disclosed, just shrouded evidence that would never be allowed to be used in any trial or news report. The pharmaceutical companies could have not asked for better legal immunity. By fiat and the stroke of a pen, Judge Louis T. Babcock made it a violation of a federal court order to hold the drug companies responsible for Columbine. We know from our conversations with our sources that both Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were using high, ever-changing doses of powerful SSRI medications until the time of the massacre. We also know from the autopsy of Eric Harris, who led the massacre, that he was still taking Luvox at the time of his death. Solvay Pharmaceuticals, the maker of Luvox, pulled Luvox off the market just 2 months after the massacre. The company claimed that it coincidentally needed to revise its manufacturing process at that time. The most damning element of the Columbine tragedy is perhaps the fact that the government had been forcefully medicating Eric Harris as part of a court-ordered anger management regimen, so there is a strong likelihood that Judge Babcock was protecting his judicial friends with his 20-year gag order on Columbine-related evidence. At the core of the Columbine school massacre were apparently 2 teenage psychopaths who suddenly began shooting down their peers, and even the people who they considered to be their personal friends, without any fear and whilst laughing about it. Even the most hardened criminals would have had trouble being so fearless and carefree as the world around them crumbled. Whatever possessed those boys was a bit more powerful than a video game. Despite what most of us would like to believe, Eric and Dylan were very typical teenage boys. Neither of them was mentally ill, and neither of them was ever in serious legal trouble. In fact, both of them were former scouts, and Eric, in particular, was just short of his Eagle Scout rank. Both of them were intellectually gifted, and they were fluent in multiple foreign languages. They were not the abnormal and hopeless washouts that we have been led to believe. It is a myth that has been perpetrated for the sake of easing our fears and subduing all honest investigations of why the massacre really happened. It is most convenient for everyone involved that the rest of us merely believe that the boys were monsters by some genetic fluke. Of course, there are also video games, rock music, and teenage angst to shift the blame onto, but none of these things have ever caused sudden homicidal hysterical psychosis. However, such tendencies are actually known side effects of the new generation of psychiatric pharmaceuticals, yet the big media companies tend to avoid this connection at all costs. Unfortunately, due to the akathisia, or emotional blunting, effect of the drugs, the lines between dreams, fantasies, and reality blurred on April 20th, 1999. It happened on Hitler's birthday. In better times, losing touch with reality was considered a terrible thing, yet this is exactly the intended design of modern psychiatric drugs, because reality is, after all, sometimes depressing. The media industry reported, at best, fluff concerning the boys' mental state, and the topic of their psychiatric drugs was categorically censored by news agencies. People who did try to report about the drugs, or who tried to take legal action against the responsible medical parties, were dealt with. John DeCamp was one of those people who were dealt with. You are about to listen to an excerpt from an interview we had with him. He is a former senator, author of The Franklin Cover-Up, and one of the practicing attorneys who represented the Columbine families during their attempt to institute a forbidden lawsuit against the drug companies. He is clearly afraid to answer certain questions, which speaks volumes about the power of the drug companies in suppressing the disclosure of facts about their products and their culpability in violent acts.
In the case of, what's his name, Harris, or Klebel, whichever one. Anyway, I happen to have, I got to be careful what I say. Remember, all the depositions I took, plus all kinds of stuff, is sealed, never to be accessed.
Yes.
You're aware of that, right?
I have heard that.
The judge ordered that, and I condemn that. But anyway,
what was his...
you'll discover, if you had access to that, for example, you would discover that it had gotten to the situation where he didn't have to go, even though officially these drugs were getting to him via a doctor certified to give drugs, a nurse, and anyway, there was a very open access, and he was doing very excessive amounts and had weird conduct and behavior going on that even that's clearly documented in those.
Can you tell us what was the actual court order? I mean, about being quiet.
They're sealed, and I'm not supposed to talk about them.
Okay.
And they actually sent some friggin' team of whatever here to supposedly go through my records and make sure I turned over everything I was supposed to. I think I might have mentioned that somewhere in my book.
Yeah, but
you said I mentioned it in that statement. I probably learned more.
But maintaining those confidential records, like you're supposed to as a representing attorney, you're not committing any crime whatsoever. What gives them the authority to come and snatch your records?
Under the legal system, judges can anyway do about what they want and get away with.
Whether it's legal or not, technically, right?
Pretty much. You must know that.
This isn't normal behavior, is it? I mean, like, for instance, I'm sure courts ask attorneys to turn over stuff to the court all the time, but they don't show up with hired guns usually to do it, do they? I mean, you know,
I guess you better talk to lawyers other than me. I don't know what all they do, because I was kind of shocked and didn't think they'd do this.
Yeah, I mean, didn't they show up with the federal marshals?
I can't remember right now.
Sorry, okay.
Remember they showed up.
Yeah, but
and that's 500 miles away they came to show up here, Nebraska, my office.
But whichever agency, they were definitely law enforcement personnel who showed up.
Well, I probably have some records or something on it, but
okay.
I haven't looked at those records in so long, you know.